Dan vs. is a very underrated show. Well, probably not everyone's cup of tea. It can give you a good laugh out of you. Well, it wasn't the most heavily pushed show due to being very different than other shows it was on. Those just made it more unique. And ever since then, it was always meant to be a cult classic. And unlike other somewhat forgotten or underrated shows, it got a decent amount of content out of it, with 3 seasons around 50 episodes, which is equal to a bit more than a standard cartoon, although definitely nowhere to something like a mainstay cartoon. I think, I'm actually not sure. And due to that, and episodes being very similar in quality, there aren't that many bad Dan vs. episodes. The worst are just kinda there and have at times not funny moments, so this show doesn't really have any horrendous, infamous episodes, though I did track one out that I barely see anyone talk about, that while not the worst thing in the world, is the worst that came from this show, and that is Dan vs. the high school reunion. Let's get into it. What's bad about this episode? Well, it's down to 2 reasons. It's not funny, and it tortures Chris. Alright, we have the obvious problem that it tortures Chris. Now you might say, don't most if not all Dan vs. episodes have Chris be tortured or get the short end of the stick in some way, shape, or form? Did I say yes? But there's a difference. One is usually funny and is usually in the background. When it comes to Chris, like in the grand scheme of things, Chris has had far worse happen to him, but it's usually a quick gag that's brushed aside. If it does stick, he's just kinda there in the background, and it's usually in a very cartoony sense, and even when it is in a more realistic situation, like with Chris and Elisa's parents, it's more just awkward. Here we just get Chris be pushed into his breaking point, and no one remembering him, and Dan revealing he ruined his dream of wearing the owl suit despite practicing presumably with his life for it. But it doesn't matter as no one really reacts to it, as they think Dan did it and we get nothing out of it. Alright, but all this can be ignored if the episode itself was funny or entertaining. It isn't. Okay, maybe that's a bit harsh. The first half is alright, but the moment they get to the high school, it completely drops in quality. Nothing really happens. Sure, Dan has his shenanigans, which is good, but that's not really saying much. It just basically also describes a lot of other episodes. And because Dan is solo there isn't much to work with, except when he goes to Chris for a couple seconds. Not saying Dan being solo can't work, but it's definitely more limiting, and Dan is the type of character that works best against other characters. Hell, until the end. Besides Chris, Dan only interacts with Elise, no one else, not even as a quick jab. And speaking of, Elise and Dan have a couple scuffles, which is entertaining, or almost, but they end in like a couple seconds. Really nothing happens, and the jokes aren't that good either. Like the joke of Noah remembering who Chris is, which even the first one of these types felt dragged on. I almost laughed, but it went way longer than I thought it was gonna be. It was just like cut in half, probably be actually good, and then it's just dragged on by there. And everyone thinking Elise is someone else, even though she never went to the high school. Oh come on, this show's better than that. And the ending, which I guess also counts as a joke, is that it turns out Dan wasn't actually hated, and instead was liked by everyone for making high school fun, I guess. And it's like, oh god, this is forced and predictable. Like the moment you see Chris' situation and what they discussed earlier, you know full well they're gonna have to flip it on Dan. Honestly, this should probably have been one of the few times Dan should have lost. Like, I mean, Dan still technically loses, but it doesn't really feel like it, and probably make it more predictable. But you win some, you lose some. Positives. Like I said, the parts before they get to the high school are alright. I like the part where Chris and Dan are talking over the phone, where Dan's trying to convince Chris to join him because of the horrible stuff that happened to him in high school, only to be revealed that it was Dan himself by Chris, with Dan immediately trying to switch the subject. I guess that's something. And to be fair, Chris isn't really tortured throughout the whole episode. He has his time to shine, having a blast singing the owl song, and at least comforts him at the end of the episode, until a bunch of scorpions go after him. This episode isn't unwatchable, but I have no desire to watch it again. Hello, my name is Bella. I'll see you next video.